Hello, this is Mrs. Popwell again, and we're going to continue looking at Chapter 11. Talk about peripheral nervous system now. It includes the cranial and spinal nerves. The peripheral nervous system connects all body parts to the brain and/or spinal cord. You have cranial nerves arising from the brain. You have part of those cranial nerves have somatic fibers connecting to the skin and skeletal muscles, and autonomic fibers connecting to the organs. Spinal nerves arising from the spinal cord. Somatic fibers of those nerves connect to the skin and skeletal muscles, and the autonomic fibers connect to the viscera or the organs. Now let's look at the structure of a peripheral nerve. A nerve is a cord-like bundle of axons wrapped in connective tissue. Now the structure of the nerve, there are three types of connective tissues or wrappings that are similar to the muscles. Only the epineurium surrounds the nerve. It's the outermost connective tissue that surrounds the whole nerve. The perineurium surrounds each fascicle, which is also a bundle of axons within the nerve. The endoneurium is around each axon and the myelin. And then, of course, in the peripheral nervous system, you have neurolema. So the endoneurium is over the neurolema. The nerve fiber classification, you have sensory nerves, or afferent or afferent nerves that only carry sensory impulses toward the central nervous system. They're rare. There are only 3 pairs of cranial nerves that are just sensory or afferent nerves. Motor nerves conduct impulses to muscle and glands. These nerves only carry motor impulses away from the central nervous system. These also are rare. There are only 5 pairs of cranial nerves that are exclusively motor or efferent nerves. Mixed nerves are nerves that carry impulses both to and from the central nervous system. It contains both sensory and motor axons. This is the most common type with two-way communication. The general somatic efferent fibers carry motor impulses from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles, efferent, away. General visceral efferent fibers carry motor impulses away from the central nervous system to the smooth muscles and glands. The general somatic afferent would be fibers that carry sensory impulses to the central nervous system from the skin and skeletal muscles. The general visceral afferent fibers carry sensory impulses to the central nervous system from the blood vessels and internal organs. Now, on the model of the spinal cord, you have the dorsal root and the ventral root, and you know that the dorsal root carries the afferent fibers and the ventral root carries the efferent or efferent fibers of those nerves. You have special somatic efferent fibers that carry motor impulses from the brain to muscles used for chewing, swallowing, speaking, and forming facial expressions. You have special visceral afferent fibers that carry sensory impulses to the brain from the olfactory and taste receptors. So specialized. You have special somatic afferent fibers that carry sensory impulses to the brain from the receptors of sight, hearing, and equilibrium. cranial nerves. Now this must look familiar to you because you have to know them for lab and you need to know them for lecture. They go pretty much in order. They're denoted by a Roman numeral. One is the olfactory, and this olfactory bulb with the olfactory tract. Then the optic. The optic tract crosses at the optic chiasma. There's the pituitary gland, the area of the midbrain. Okay, the oculomotor. Here's the pons. Sitting toward the midline of the pons is the oculomotor. As you move down a little inferior, still lateral to the pons, is the trochlear. Now, the trochlear actually comes from, you can't see it from this view, but it comes from the more posterior to the pons and comes up to the side. Okay, the trochlear, it's pretty small. The largest of the cranial nerves is the trigeminal, and we're moving down in order. So the trigeminal comes off the pons. So the oculomotor, center median to its superior pons here, and then more lateral and a little bit inferior is the trochlear. Coming from behind the pons is the trochlear nerve, and then the largest of the cranial nerves coming off the pons also is the trigeminal. Now find the medulla oblongata, and toward the midline of the medulla oblongata is going to be the abducens. Going straight down the side, the next one is going to be the facial, number 7. Number 8 is going to be the next cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Number 10, the vagus. Now the vagus is the vagabond. That word means vagabond. It is the longest of the cranial nerves, going all the way down to the stomach. The viscera in the abdominal region. Number 11 is easy to recognize. It's like a ladder that is travels from the base of the medulla oblongata down to the spinal cord, the accessory nerves. And then the only nerve that doesn't really go in order on the brainstem and down the brain and brainstem, you go back toward the midline, and on either side of the midline of the medulla oblongata is the hypoglossal. Again, there are 2 pairs of the cranial nerves that come from the forebrain and 10 pairs from the brainstem. The cranial nerves again are designated by the Roman numerals. The olfactory, sense of smell. Remember, the olfactory bulb and tract go directly to the brain, and so smell, the sense of smell is actually interpreted directly from the nerve, so there's no other tissue in between that nerve and the brain. So it activates the limbic system, and you can have an emotional response to the sense of smell. It is sensory only. It's a sensory nerve. It is afferent. The optic nerve, for the sense of vision, it's sensory only. Oculomotor innervates the eye muscles that helps control the movement of the eyes. Oculo, having to do with the eye and motor movement. It is motor only, so it is efferent. The trochlear innervates the eye muscles, and it also is motor only. The trigeminal, the largest of the cranial nerves, it has sensory branch that goes to the face. It has a branch that goes to the chewing muscles. It has a branch that goes to the upper maxilla right above the teeth. So if you have a toothache, then it's going to affect the trigeminal. Pressure in the jaw, like from a swollen gland, could put pressure on the trigeminal and cause you to have headaches. It's just an interesting, really an interesting nerve. The abducens innervates the eye muscles only. It is motor only. By the way, the trigeminal is a mixed nerve. Abducens, eye muscles, motor only. Facial innervates muscles for facial expression and the sense of taste. It is a mixed nerve. Vestibulocochlear gives you the sense of hearing and equilibrium. When you look at the ear, you will see the vestibular branch, and then that gives you equilibrium, and the cochlear branch for hearing. It is sensory only. Glossopharyngeal moves the tongue and the pharynx muscles. It is mixed. The vagus innervates the visceral organs of the abdominal area. It innervates the visceral smooth muscles. It is mixed. Accessory innervates the neck muscles. It is motor only. The hypoglossal moves the tongue. It is motor only. A good way to remember is this mnemonic device. Oh, 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 to touch and feel very good velvet. Ah. Use the first letter of each one of those and then the H there, and you have your 12 cranial nerves to help you memorize the 12 cranial nerves. O, 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 T, T, A, F, V, G, V, A, H. The spinal nerve is formed from the fusion of the dorsal and ventral root. Then the spinal nerve passes through the intervertebral foramen. They're all mixed nerves, 31 pairs. There's 8 cervical nerves, C1 through C8, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. The spinal nerves are associated with the spinal cord and named for the region of the spinal cord from which they arise. The spinal nerves has the dorsal root, and there's the dorsal root there. The axons of the dorsal root are sensory neurons and then the dorsal root ganglion, the bundle of soma. The dorsal root ganglion, cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The ventral root, axons of motor neurons whose cell bodies are in the spinal cord, so you don't have that bulge on that ventral root. Spinal nerve is the union of the ventral root and the dorsal root, so it is a mixed nerve. Here's where the nerve branches and goes to different areas. This is called the pre-ganglionic fibers and then post-ganglionic, but there's a ganglia outside of the nervous system along on a peripheral nerve. Dermatome, it gives you the area of skin that the sensory nerve fibers of a particular spinal nerve innervate. Okay, sort of looks like the rules of 9, but this is called dermatome. I would know the definition of the word. The nerve plexus, the spinal nerve plexus, is a complex network that's formed by anterior branches of spinal nerves. Fibers of various spinal nerves are sorted and recombined. The cervical plexus, or neck muscles in the diaphragm for breathing, very complex nerve plexus. The solar plexus works the cervical nerve plexus and controls the diaphragm. Okay, so you're out playing touch football and somebody decides to tackle you and knocks the breath out of you. That is, it actually, the response of not being able to breathe is because there's been a blow to those nerves, those solar plexus, and it causes you to lose your breath. That feeling of losing your breath or not being able to catch your breath after being tackled or a blow to the chest. The brachial plexus give you the complex nerve fibers to the upper arm, the lumbar plexus to the anterior median thigh, and the sacral plexus to the posterior and lower leg. Each resulting branch of the plexus contains fibers from several spinal nerves. Fibers from each spinal nerves are carried to the body periphery via several different roots and branches. Therefore, damage to one spinal segment cannot completely paralyze any limb muscle. Autonomic nervous system functions without conscious control. It controls visceral activities, regulates smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. It's innervated by efferent fibers, typically lead to the ganglia outside of the central nervous system. Afferent sends the information from these organs and the efferent fibers, and then ganglia outside of the nervous system. There's 2 divisions. The sympathetic division prepares the body for fight or flight situations, stressful situations. Parasympathetic prepares the body for resting and digestive activities. They have opposing effects to one another. They're antagonistic. All of the autonomic nerve fibers are motor or efferent. They are preganglionic fibers. The axons of the preganglionic neurons make up these nerves. The neuron cell bodies are in the central nervous system. Postganglionic fibers, the axon of the postganglionic neurons, and the cell bodies are in ganglia. Okay, preganglionic are in the central nervous system for the soma or cell bodies. Postganglionic, the cell bodies are in ganglia. Okay, let's talk again about the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. It's activated in times of stress, fight or flight, like we talked about. It increases blood flow to the skeletal muscles so you can fight or flight, run away. It shuts down digestion so it can shunt the blood to the skeletal muscles so that you can fight or flight. Generally increases heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure so that you can have more oxygen and more glucose and more energy for fight or flight. Generally increase in metabolism, so all of the above. The rector pili muscle may constrict, which gives you goosebumps, and you may perspire. Palms of your hands and areas where you don't usually perspire. The peripheral division is just the opposite. It maintains normal resting condition. It promotes digestion, but does not excite most things. It is antagonistic to the sympathetic division, opposing each other, working against each other. And I think I had mentioned before, being in a stressful situation where the parasympathetic division is kicked in is very exhausting. Eventually, a person in a very stressful situation is going to hit the wall, just like a runner running a marathon, and he's exerted all his energy and can't go any further and collapses in the path of the other runners. We say he's hit the wall. And that's what happens if you stay for an extended period of time with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system in a stressful situation. In the sympathetic division, the preganglion fibers emerge from the thoracic lumbar region of the spinal cord. There's short pre-ganglionic fibers and long post-ganglionic fibers. Okay, so the ganglion are close to the spinal cord, so the very short pre-ganglionic and long post-ganglionic. Okay, there may be other ganglions along the way. Here they are. Okay. Ganglia are close to the spinal cord and very long nerve fibers. We said those axons could be very long, and remember that a nerve impulse, no matter how long that nerve fiber is, once that action potential is generated, it stays at the same intensity the entire distance, not losing any of its velocity. Just as a review for those graded responses for local membrane changes, it would decrease in intensity over distance traveled. But these long post-ganglionic fibers, the same intensity for the nerve impulse is kept all the way. Parasympathetic division, you have preganglionic fibers, the long preganglionic fibers, and short postganglionic fibers. So the ganglia are closer to the organs. Okay. Ganglia mostly down in effector organs. All the way, see, here's the ganglia within the organs. So you have they're very long fibers, long preganglionic fibers, and very, very short postganglionic fibers, with most of the ganglia within the organs, except for these in the upper region. Autonomic nervous system neurotransmitters. They're released. The preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division usually release norepinephrine. But a few release acetylcholine also. Remember, acetylcholine, most of the time it is an excitatory, and norepinephrine is more of an inhibitory. But the action, whether it is excitatory or inhibitory, depends on the receptor, and different areas that these nerves innervate will have different receptors. So it depends on the receptor present as to whether or not that acetylcholine and norepinephrine is excitatory or inhibitory. Postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine. Sympathetic fight or flight. So usually acetylcholine fight or flight, and sympathetic would be excitatory, and the norepinephrine inhibitory. And remember, norepinephrine's more associated with smooth muscles, acetylcholine sometimes, but usually skeletal muscles. Preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine. The action is, look at that, excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor. And what's the final word? Whether it's inhibitory or excitatory. Remember, excitatory takes it closer to action potential. It takes it closer to that negative 55 millivolts or threshold, and if it gets to threshold, then it will move on to an action potential by opening up all those voltage-gated ion regulators, voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay? Inhibitory would mean that it would usually make the membrane potential more negative or hyperpolarized, keeping it further away from action potential. A way it could do that with that receptor that it receives to be inhibitory with the acetylcholine and the receptor in the area where it does not allow for the closing of the potassium gate until the membrane has become hyperpolarized, further away from action potential. With the sympathetic division, along with norepinephrine, you can also have the release of noradrenaline and adrenaline, which would also be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor. The terminating factor or action of the neurotransmitter, the termination of the action of the neurotransmitter, how's it stopped from its action? We learned about that when we were talking about muscles, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. To stop the action of acetylcholine, you need acetylcholine esterase to break down that acetylcholine and acetic acid and choline. And acetic acid is reuptake by the synaptic knob, joins up with choline and makes more acetylcholine for the next time around. Control of the autonomic activity is largely by the central nervous system. The medulla oblongata regulates cardiac vasomotor. What's vasomotor? The dilation or constriction of the blood vessels. So vasomotor is blood pressure and respiratory activities. The hypothalamus regulates visceral functions. The limbic system and the cerebral cortex controls emotional responses. Lifespan changes. The brain cells begin to die before birth, and they're not usually replaced. Over lifetime, the brain shrinks by 10%. Most cell death occurs in the temporal lobes. By age 90, the frontal lobe has lost half of its neurons. So no wonder these people forget things. The number of dendritic branches decreases. Decreased levels of neurotransmitters, fading memory. Slow responses and reflexes, changes increase risk of falling, and then you have sleep problems. That reticular formation is affected. I'll look at some of the clinical applications. Cerebral energies and abnormalities. Concussions, when the brain is jarred against the cranium. And remember, I mentioned the NFL is doing research on brain injuries because there have been a lot of athletes who have passed away or currently have ALS. Probably as a result of brain injuries. You have football players that are not making good decisions with their anger and lashing out at their loved ones, the loss of memory, temporary loss of memory, and many concussions to more permanent loss of memory, mental cloudiness, headache, and usually there is a full recovery, but repeated concussions actually do injury to the brain, permanent injury to the brain. Now, a cerebral vascular incident or accident or incident would be a stroke, a sudden interruption of blood flow. The brain tissue dies from the lack of oxygen, basically, nutrients and oxygen. When tissue begins to die, it's usually from lack of oxygen. It becomes ischemic. Ischemic tissue is ISCHEMIC. That's tissue that begins to die, becomes ischemic because of lack of oxygen. ISCHEMIC. Remember that one. Cerebral palsy, motor impairment at birth caused by blocked cerebral blood vessels during development, seizures, and learning disabilities. Okay, add spina bifida. When the nervous system is developing, there is a neural tube that develops into the brain and spinal cord, and spina bifida is abnormal neural tube development causing an open spinal cord and vertebral column. I'm going to repeat that. Spina bifida, abnormal neural tube development when the fetus is developing in the womb. It causes an open spinal cord and vertebral column. A neuroma, Neuroma, neuroma. It is a tangled mass of nerve fibers that sometimes develops following an amputation. A neuroma, tangled mass of nerve fibers that sometimes develop after an amputation. A hematoma is where a blood accumulates between the dura and arachnoid mater. I mentioned it earlier. Aphasia. What is that? The loss of speech. Meningitis. It's inflammation between the arachnoid and pia mater, caused by bacterial or viral infections. A spinal tap, looking at the condition of the cerebral spinal fluid, and if it's cloudy, then that's an indication of probably meningitis. This is the end of Chapter 11.